Hello, adult Sunday school leader. Last week we looked at the mission of Jesus, and that is why he left heaven and came to earth. This week we're going to be examining the ministry of Jesus, or what he did while he was here. So that's our second lesson that's in this unit that's called It's All About Jesus. The focal passage is out of Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 23 and 27 through 31. And the point of this lesson is, through his miracles and teaching, Jesus pointed us to a relationship with God. So let's first differentiate between three sets of people that we're going to see in this story. We have a large crowd, which is all the people who came to see Jesus, many of whom were there to be physically healed or delivered from evil spirits. Within that group are his disciples. Okay, now let's remember that a disciple of Jesus is simply a learner. It's someone who follows him. We sometimes use that term disciple to refer to those 12 men whom Jesus chose, also known as his apostles. But in this context, the disciples are the people in that large crowd who believe in and are following Jesus. Then within that group is a smaller group of 12, his apostles. Now, looking back in verse 12 and 13, we see those three groups. Jesus spent the entire night praying, and when morning came, he called his followers, and within that group of followers, or disciples, he chose the 12 apostles, who are named there in verses 14 through 16. So here's where we begin our first set of verses, Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. So Jesus, he went down from the mountain with them, it says, and the them would be his 12 apostles just mentioned in the previous verses. Went down from there where he was praying all night, and he stood on a level place. Then lots of people gathered around. Some were his disciples, and others were from all over, from Judea, Jerusalem, Tyre, and Sidon. Well, in the previous chapter, Jesus, he's ministering in Galilee, the northern part of Israel. So since these other places are mentioned as places that people came from, I believe we can safely assume that this is taking some place in the north, in Galilee. And why did all these people come to see Jesus? Well, they came to hear him and to be healed. Jesus had this ministry of restoration and reconciliation. He physically restored people to health, but he also spiritually restored people by casting out those unclean spirits. Verse 19 reminds me of the lesson we had just a few weeks ago on the woman with an issue of blood. She knew that if she could just reach out and touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she would be healed. And so that was the thought of those in the crowd as well. And it's not clear if, like the woman with the issue of blood, they were healed just by touching Jesus, or if Jesus touched them for the healing to take place. But either way, we should note that all the people who were there for a healing were cured. And this showed the compassion that Jesus had for the people. Now we go on to Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through 23, which starts what we know as the Sermon on the Plain. And as you read these verses, you may think, these sound very familiar to Matthew 5 through 7, which is known as the Sermon on the Mount. And there's a lot of similarities here between our passage today and the Sermon on the Mount. But there are a lot of differences as well. In Matthew, Jesus went up on the mountain and sat down to teach, and here he was on a mountain and went down to a level place. That's why this is sometimes called the Sermon on the Plain, because it's a level place. Well, I have preached the same message in different churches, but my delivery was not always exactly the same. I may have phrased something a little bit differently, or maybe used different examples, but the general theme of the message was identical. So when we examined this sermon and the Sermon on the Mount, we find that the content is similar, but there's enough difference in the message and the setting to show that it's the same basic message given on two different occasions. Well, this section starts off similarly to the Sermon on the Mount with blessings, also known as Beatitudes. Jesus looked at his disciples and he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, who hunger now, who weep now. And when people hate you, you're blessed." Let's dissect that a little bit. First of all, let's talk about the word blessed or blessed, B-L-E-S-S-E-D. And for one thing, I've always found it interesting that we only say blessed in church, right? The rest of the time when we see BLESSED, we say blessed. I don't know what's up with that. Now, what does that word blessed mean? Some translations use the word happy, which the Greek word can be translated as that. But, the way we use happy today, it's an emotion, right? And it kind of goes up and down. Happiness does. I really think this has a deeper meaning than that. The Bible Studies for Life podcast mentioned the phrase deeply satisfied, which I think really best fits what Jesus is conveying here. I also like that word joyful instead of happy. Now, who is Jesus talking to? He's not addressing everyone, but he's addressing his disciples, his followers. So that's an important part of knowing how to apply these verses, is whom he is talking to. Now, let's look at what the ancient Jewish culture thought it meant to be blessed by God. If things were going well in your life, then you were blessed by God. If not, then something's wrong. That's why Job's friends kept quizzing him on what he did. You must have done something wrong in order for all these calamities to fall on you. And when Jesus said it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven, the disciples exclaimed, "Who then can be saved?" Because in their minds, being rich meant being blessed by God. We see that in Luke chapter 18, verses 24 through 26. Now, let's look and see what Jesus said. He was telling them to look at the long term and not just the here and now. And as he addressed his followers, he said they were blessed, or they were to be deeply satisfied, if they were poor, weeping, hungry, and hated. And that right there flew in the face of the culture. In the Jewish mind, these were things that showed that somehow you were out of favor with God, not blessed by him. But Jesus didn't say they were to be deeply satisfied just because they were those things. They were to consider themselves blessed because the kingdom of God is theirs. Yes, as a follower of mine, Jesus was saying, you may not have a lot now, but you can't even imagine what's in store for you. And the Apostle Paul reflected this thought in 1 Corinthians 2:9 when he wrote, "What no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him." As Jesus' followers, we are to focus on the long term, those long-term benefits that await us, not our immediate condition. And the same thought continues through the rest of these blessings. You may be hungry now, but wait, you will be satisfied. You may be crying now, but you'll eventually be in a place where there are no tears or no crying, like Revelation 21:4 tells us. And find yourself blessed when people talk about you, when they exclude you, when they used to include you, now they exclude you. Find yourself blessed. Find yourself blessed when they hate you. Okay? Not because of anything you've done or because you're a jerk, but because you are my follower. Your reward isn't here, it's in heaven. And remember those prophets of old that you learned about in the synagogue? Those men whom you look up to and whose writings you study? That's how they were treated as well. So consider it a privilege to be hated for the sake of the Messiah, just as the prophets of old were. Remember, your pain is only temporary, but your gain will last eternally. And in verses 24 through 26, which are not in our lesson text this week, Jesus flips the script. He says, "Not blessed, but woe to you who are living for the short term. You may be rich, well-fed, happy, and popular now. Your gain is only temporary, but your pain will last eternally." Well, let's remember that these verses do not say that anyone who is poor and hungry in this world have heaven to look forward to, and those who are rich and popular don't. He is saying that if you are a follower of mine and are suffering, your reward awaits you in heaven. And if you are rich and popular now but aren't a follower of mine, your reward is only in this life, definitely not in the next. Our last set of verses is in Luke 6:27 through 31. And again, he's speaking to his disciples, his followers. Remember those who Jesus mentioned up in verse 22, those who hate, exclude, reject you. How are you to treat them? Not with contempt, not with retribution, but with love. That's that agape love. Self-sacrificing. This message transcends human instinct and societal norms. It challenges us to break free from the cycle of hatred and retaliation and embody the transformative power of love. And Jesus would not ask his followers to do anything that he wasn't willing to do. Before the crucifixion, he was beaten, slapped, whipped, all these things. But Jesus didn't raise his voice. He didn't retaliate. 1 Peter 2:23 tells us that. In fact, he even prayed for those who were executing him while he was on the cross. The Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing, out of Luke 23:34. As we think about this sermon that Jesus delivered on a plain, on a level place about 2,000 years ago, how can we apply this to our lives? Well, first, we've got to examine our focus. Are we living just for the here and now? Or are our hearts and minds set on the eternal? When we are wronged, do we seek retribution? Or do we exhibit the love that Jesus showed his enemies? Do we forgive and are willing to extend love and compassion even to those who mistreat us? And what about our priorities? Are they material wealth and worldly success, or are they the pursuit of God's kingdom? You may have heard one way to define faith is an acrostic of that word, F-A-I-T-H, which stands for forsaking all, I trust him. And you know what? That is so easy to say in church, so easy to say in the Sunday school class, but is that true? Are we really willing to sacrifice comfort and security for the sake of following Christ? In a world that's plagued by injustice and division and hatred, we are to embrace humility and compassion and love. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but I think sometimes it's easier to exhibit those qualities to non-Christians than it is to fellow believers. As we approach the presidential election in November, please exhibit Christ-like love and humility to those who are on the other side of the aisle from you, especially those in your church and in your Sunday school class. And please encourage your class to do the same. I have seen people transfer to another class or even another church because of careless comments made from a teacher or a pastor. Please don't bring politics into the classroom. Yeah, you want to talk about issues? That's great. But candidates, no, don't do that, okay? Now, Christianity, it's about going above and beyond. It's not easy. It's not natural, but it's doable with the help of the Holy Spirit, which only comes from a relationship with God, which is what Jesus' miracles and teachings point us to. Next week, we're going to be looking at the identity of Jesus out of Luke chapter 9. Thank you guys so much for watching. I do appreciate you. Don't forget, pray for and with your class.